welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the networking session just now and met some new faces from the audience. Today, this second panel will be about discrimination and diversity in AI. So AI technology really promises us considerable economic and societal benefits, but some of its racial and sexist biases are forcing us to reassess its merits. At the root of this problem is the lack of diversity in the AI field, which is really perpetrating the gender and racial biases. If this remains unchanged, we are at the risk of replicating historical biases with AI, such as image recognition services, making offensive classifications of minorities, chatbots adopting hate speech, and recently Amazon's technology failing to recognize users with darker skin tones. So this session today will be moderated by Vaibhav Namburi. He's the director at 521, a consultancy service for tech platforms. He will also be joined by Jorge Cueto. He's an advisor at the Stanford Institute at Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Ovetta, Sampson, she's the principal creative director at Microsoft, and Oriana Medlicott, Philosopher and head of operations at Ethical Intelligence Associates, to really discuss how we can increase diversity in the tech field and reduce biases in AI experiences, counteracting any racial or gender biases in the interest of its users. So now I will invite everyone back to the stage. Hi ladies.
Hey.
Vaibhav and Jorge to also re-request. Amazing.
How are you?
I am good. How is everyone?
How you doing?
Doing great.
I'm good. I'm trying to stay awake.
Time is over there.
It's getting close to my bedtime.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. So, Vaibhav, I'm going to pass over the stage to you now.
Awesome. As we all know, as Lily mentioned, I think a large part of the conversation when it comes to artificial intelligence goes beyond just predicting data. A large part of AI's implementation comes in the HR space, and it comes in with respect to cognitive understanding, human intelligence breakdowns, and what that brings in a layer of bias that we tentatively see sometimes just naturally, but also with artificial intelligence. So the first question I actually wanted to throw out to the panel was the impact of a lack of workplace diversity. So with that, a healthy mixture of gender and ethnicities, what do you think this causes as an effect on the priorities for developing AI software? So I'll start off that question with Oriana, who's on my top left. So you can probably start if you'd like, and we can move on to the next person.
Yeah, so I think having a healthy mix of gender and racial diversity and kind of diversity in all senses, like disabilities and people from all different walks of life is extremely important when we're looking at HR and how people are hiring. I think we've seen predominantly, especially in the tech world, there has been this huge lack of diversity in the coding and the development of technologies and the deployment of technology. So realistically, it's kind of just going to be reflecting already biases that have happened in our society for centuries now, especially if it's going to be, a white-dominated kind of world right now, and the white domination of male as well. So I think that's kind of why I think we need to make this stride to ensure that we have, because if we don't have every voice represented, how can we ever have that reflected in the technology that's being developed?
Awesome. That's a fair point. And I'd love to get your thoughts as well, Ovetta, on that exact topic as to what you think is the impact of a lack of diversity in the workplace environment, and necessarily how does that affect then the priorities in developing AI software to handle bias?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with a story about this guy named Robert McDaniel. He was grew up and born on the south side of Chicago, and specifically the southwest side. So I was born on the southwest side of Chicago as well. And so Robert McDaniel was a kid who probably normally, like normal Black kids, teenagers growing up on the south side of Chicago, knew trouble, but never was really arrested, never was really charged with anything, just had a bunch of people that he knew in his neighborhood who were proximity crime. That's what I call it, where, you know, all crime is local, right? And so he knew a lot of people who were into a lot of different things. And then one day he was sitting on his couch and 2 police officers showed up and knocked on his door, and he was very surprised because he was like, I've never been in trouble with law. What are you doing here? And it was a police commander, and they said, we're watching you. That's basically what they said, you know, stay out of trouble. And then they left. And after a series of investigations by independent journalists, it was found that an algorithm for predictive policing brought those police to Robert's door. So the algorithm was created actually by a guy who wanted to do good, a white guy from the University of Chicago who was into social science and research, and he wanted to help the police stop crime. So now this is what we talk about intent, right, versus impact, right? And so his intent was that he would help and write an algorithm that would tell the police where most crimes occurred and also where most arrests occurred and where the proximity of those arrests were, so that the police could concentrate their resources on these neighborhoods. Well, anybody who's ever stepped outside of a university building knows that proximity does not equal causation, right? And Robert got put on a list of 400, it's called the hit list, a hot list of about 4,000 individuals in Chicago who were predicted by this algorithm to commit a crime. Now, this is not Minority Report. This is real. This list exists. It's called a strategic subject list. It took years to get the Chicago Police Department just to even release that there was a list, let alone the algorithm behind it. So now I was a police reporter for 8 years before I went into design and tech. And if I had been in the room and the professor had said, hey, I'm going to do this algorithm that's going to predict where crime occurs, I could have really told him, I've studied police statistics for over a decade, and let me tell you, they're biased. So if you do start making this algorithm, I'm going to tell you, you're going to get biased results, and you're going to end up putting people as a target for the police who are innocent. And that's exactly what happened with Robert McDaniel. So the point of the story is there's a lot of things wrong with that story, but the number one thing that was wrong with that story was nobody from Robert McDaniel's neighborhood was around this process of creating this product of predictive policing. There was nobody from the south side of Chicago, nobody who grew up near him, nobody who knew his circumstances, nobody who talked to his family, nobody around there who looked at Robert not as a criminal, but as a person who I grew up with. Like, that's how I see Robert, right? He looks like a lot of guys I grew up with in my neighborhood. And I knew them personally to be surrounded by crime, but not criminals. And so if you don't have that point of view, beyond demographics, beyond gender, beyond race, beyond sexual orientation, all that, that's great. But you really need the mental model of somebody who didn't go to Harvard, Stanford, Connecticut, whatever, to be in the room to bring that up. I cannot expect somebody who went to Stanford or MIT or whatever, and who grew up in South suburban LA to understand Robert McDaniel. Like, we could ask, right? Like, we could try, but that's a stretch. So it's not about diversity for race, demographic sake. It's about anybody who understands science, anybody who understands math, anybody who understands technology is about mental models. You need people with different mental models in the room to create good technology. We don't have to argue about that. That's a known fact. People want people with different mental models to help create better products. And so that's the narrative I try to put it in, because when you try to put it in the diversity or gender, or people operate from a spirit of fear, and they think that you're taking a piece of the pie away from them. And what I'm saying is, you have a narrow narrative if everybody in the room has the same mental model. And all I'm saying is to widen the narrative so you can have better products. And to do that is you need people with different mental models. And that comes from their background, who they are, their experiences, their life, plus what they look like, their gender, and their sexuality.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a very, very unique and interesting insight, brother. And being on the other side of the world, we unfortunately, or at least I unfortunately, don't get to hear much of these, raw, authentic stories. But no, honestly, thank you so much for sharing that. And Jorge, I'd love to hear from your side as well. What your thought on this this topic of discussion is around the impact of workplace diversity when deciding to bring in software or develop AI in the concept of bias, whether it has to be race, gender, sexual orientation, or whatever it may be.
No offense to Stanford, Jorge. That's cool.
Yeah. No offense taken. Yeah, for me personally, it has to do just with the simple reality that we as humans will care more about the things that personally impact us. And that's just reality. Like, no matter our best intentions, that's just how it is. And it takes being honest with ourselves. So, like, I care deeply about diversity. I care deeply about creating inclusive environments, but I just cannot possibly understand some things that women go through. And there's just like, no matter how much I try, I just won't understand it in the same way. I just won't perceive certain things or notice certain things because I haven't lived that experience. And so just even acknowledging that, like, for each of ourselves, that there are certain experiences that because we haven't lived those experiences, and they don't necessarily impact us personally. There's just some things that no matter how much we try, they're gonna go across our radar, and we just have to be conscious of that. And because of that, we have to realize that we have to get in as many different people who have as many different lived experiences as possible, that we can draw from each of these different perspectives, so that hopefully, even though we each cannot possibly create a complete picture of the positive impacts of a technology, of the potential harms of a technology, at least if we bring in as many different perspectives as possible, hopefully that will allow us to cover as much ground as possible. One, so that we can take as much advantage of the technology as possible to benefit as many people as possible, and also to be aware of as many potentially harmful consequences, because we all have blind spots. So the more of us that can get together and work together on a problem, the more likely it is that we'll be able to identify as many of those potential blind spots that could arise.
No, that's fair. I think that's a very unique, and I correlate with you on that as well. Is I try to champion that as much as I can within my team and company, but in the end, just things that I don't know, and that's where you sort of seek expert advice or people who are on the other side to understand how you can do the best you can to make them feel welcomed, and whatever that difference may be. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for those questions, for those answers. I really respect and appreciate everyone's thoughts. I think I want to go beyond just corporate diversity. I think, and this is a very difficult and just interesting topic, right? And I'll dive a little further than what the question actually, originally set up was, and to throw a little spanner inside the questions for you all. But the first question, essentially, or we'll start off with, what do you think companies should do to ensure unhealthy mixture of diversity in general, whether that's gender or ethnicity. How do you ensure that their work reflects society that they serve? Now, that's the loaded question, but what I want to add to the tail end of that is this common rhetoric that I've actually seen happen a lot on Twitter is around the principle of what culture means, right? Is culture a gateway to prevent bringing people of a different mental model into your business? So does culture, the excuse of culture actually start driving a bias in itself? So it's a complement to the main question is where does that start, right? What do people need to do to bring in that healthy mixture of diversity? And how do you think these people or companies are going to work towards bringing that to serve their society? I will go in the same order. I'll start off with Oriana, if you can kick off.
Yeah, I think that's quite a hard question in the sense of
it is. Yeah.
Yeah, like when we look at I have personally worked in HR in a few in medium-sized business and in a large corporate, and I think some of the approaches to diversity are kind of backwards in a sense. It's kind of just feeling kind of a quota, and it doesn't feel almost authentic in how people go about trying to get that space diverse in a sense. And I think it's become a buzzword, especially in corporates, diversity inclusion, and these training models. But I think, yeah, like you were saying about the culture, and we have a culture in a company, and I think it's hard to sometimes get the people that would actually make a difference when using tech now with AI. It could be hard. Why would someone of a certain demographic, like Ovetta was saying, if you come from a certain background and you've only been around certain people from a certain background, why would you want to come into maybe a space where everyone's been to like Harvard and MIT? And even if someone might look like you, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to feel like you can actually make a difference in that space. So in terms of how companies change their approach, I think statistics are good and bad. Like we've seen a lot of companies again diverging their statistics of how many people they have in corporate, the higher positions and in the lower positions, and bringing out those quotas and how they're going to make a difference. But I think it's actually hard how we're going to make that meaningful impact. But I think we need to make sure that we are making sure that the tech we're developing is going to have all the voices heard. And I think from the HR standpoint, it really needs more training, and we need people from all backgrounds giving that training to make sure, again, that we can get that in. So yeah, I feel like it's a hard one to really answer in a whole, because I think every industry and every corporate has, whether it's small or large, has, like you said, their culture, and will they really be able to get the meaningful voices that they need to make that difference? I think it's going to be a long-term journey.
Fair enough. I think that's again, this question is a very loaded one, and it's difficult to answer. I don't think it can be answered over one sitting, but that was a very interesting and rather a good perspective. So thank you for that. I'd love to.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say it could have been a bit cynical, but I feel like it's just going to be a long-term journey that we have to keep working on.
No, you're not wrong. I think a lot of these things are built. A bias is an innate thing, right? Sometimes it's the thing about biases are they're unconscious, and if they're unconscious, how do you root something that's unconscious? So when you're yourself not aware of what you're biased for is kind of the catch-22 that you get stuck in. But yeah, I'd love to get your response as well on this, Ovetta.
Yeah. So I have a question about that. Are African American companies diverse? That was so. The reason why I asked that question is because there is. So I have this trigger thing about unconscious bias, because I sometimes feel people use that as just this nice label for being racist, to be quite honest. So 100%, we are humans and we are biased, but there is no accident that most CEOs and most companies are white male. Like, that's engineered. That's not bias, right? Because if it was bias, then we would have a chance of these companies even statistically being a lot more diverse, just randomly being a lot more diverse. So the numbers tell me when there's only like one Black CEO left now, one Black female CEO of a public company, of all the public companies in on the NASDAQ in the United States, that's engineering, right? Like, that's not randomness or some kind of, we all have bias and it just kind of happens. So because lack of diversity is designed, I'm a designer, it can be redesigned. And how do we start with redesigning? If you tell me the CEO of a company and you tell me what the CEO values, I will tell you what the company looks, thinks, and feels. Period. Doesn't matter. That's how organizations run. Unless you're either Marie Antoinette or the French revolutionaries, right? And there are no corporate French revolutionaries running around. Most corporations are a reflection of their CEO. And the reason why I asked the question, are Black companies diverse? I think of Ariel Investments in Chicago, one of the largest and oldest Black financial companies in the world. And it's very diverse with women and gender and color and all that kind of stuff. So if minority companies can be diverse, then why can't the flip side? Why are they diverse? And I say it's by design. It's by design. And so if you want to fix, and this is my simple answer for all of this. If you want an organization that's less racist, less homophobic, less transphobic, less sexist, less whatever ism, then hire a CEO that's none of those things. Because if you hire a CEO that's none of those things, that CEO will create the community, culture, and organization to be none of those things. I feel like we're making this a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. But I understand why, because there's a lot of things going on here. But to me, every corporate culture reflects from the top down, right? And if you think about, like, one of the things that got me thinking about this and really got me looking at this, I have this thought now from all of these corporations saying we stand by Black Lives Matter and all this kind of stuff. And my first thought was, you don't get to speak without receipts. I'm looking for receipts. And like, Ben and Jerry gave me receipts. Like, I went to them, I looked up their board, I looked up their executive management, it's receipts, they have receipts. And so to me, it's pretty obvious. If you want to be a diverse organization, then you engineer and design that.
I love that. I love the that you compare, like, you use the word receipts, because I've actually seen a lot of people be called out for it, and I've been thoroughly enjoying it as an observer when someone goes ahead and says something. And I recently learned, I mean, I kept seeing this on the internet, but I recently learned of the definition. It's called, I think, virtue signaling is the term that's used. Is like, you just put a black tile on Instagram and you think that's it, but it goes beyond that. And I loved how you actually, and I said the same thing. Like, I get into arguments with a few people. I'm like, yeah, all good for you to just say something, but what have you actually done? Have you donated? Have you contributed? Have you done something? Have you spoken to people?
I'm looking for receipts. That's all I'm looking for. I don't really care about anything else.
Yeah,
right.
Anyone can schedule an Instagram post, but what have you actually done to reflect, other than just being a cool influencer? So I love that. Similar to Jorge, I'm clapping in my head. So that's why I was smiling as well. I think that's a great way to put it. But I'll pass it on to Jorge. Mate, I'd love to get your thought on this exact question. Is how do you fix beyond corporate diversity, how do you go ahead and ensure that there's a healthy mixture of separation of people, different identities, religious beliefs, gender, race, whatever it may be?
Yeah, building on the theme of intentionality, I think one of the key things is to build intentionality, you have to acknowledge that the problem is there. And in order to acknowledge the problem that the problem is there, you have to put in resources and research into figuring out what's our current situation. And the reality is that right now, a lot of companies are too scared to even take a look at what their diversity numbers currently look like. And if they do have a sense of that, they're scared of publishing it because they're worried that people are going to say, oh, look at this company has abysmal diversity numbers and are not going to want to work there. But the reality is that if you just turn a blind eye to it or try to ignore it or not talk about it, it's not going to get addressed, because you need to, as a company, be honest with yourself. And yeah, it's difficult to acknowledge that, but in acknowledging it, you're putting more pressure on yourself, more external pressure, and that's going to create incentives for people all across the company to focus more energy into addressing that problem, because then it's not just going to be a matter of, someone who works here knows that this is a problem because they look around them and then they don't see any other women on their team, or they don't see any other Latinos or Black people on their team. It will be that there's news organizations that know about this, students who are thinking of applying that know about this. And so the company will then force itself to be in a position where it has to address this. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to hire new talent. And the other thing is that I think companies have to be willing to stop this sort of like, we are expecting people to come to us, and we're hiring, but people are going to apply to us. No, I think as part of this intentionality, companies have to make the effort to go out and go recruit in places that maybe they haven't recruited from before. So as we discussed previously, like, you can't just keep hiring from Stanford, Harvard, other elite universities. You have to look at universities that have really talented students and who are also very diverse, from historically Black colleges, Hispanic Serbian institutions, any majority college, colleges that have high Pell Grant students, colleges that serve particularly low-income and first-generation college students. And the reality is that there's no established pipeline to many of these institutions currently. And so those are going to have to be first steps, new initiatives that have to be taken by companies. And we have to get out of this mindset that they're going to come to us. I think companies have to start getting into the mindset that they have to be the ones that reach out to these communities. Because also, like, there has to be a genuine sense from the perspective of the people looking to work there. Like, I want to see that a company genuinely cares about having me there as an employee, not that it's just a matter of checking a box or fulfilling some process. Like, I want to see a genuine effort, and it goes back to the conversation of receipts. And I also, like, even if a company does have abysmal numbers, I think it does speak to there being an effort to improve them if the company releases them. So that's another thing. I would encourage more resources to be placed into identifying the true state of diversity and inclusion at a company, and also propagating that information outward so that key stakeholders within the company know what's going on, but then also the outside world knows what's going on, so that there could be pressure inward.
Fair enough. I think those are all great points by everyone. So thank you for sharing that. What I want to, I've got a few points to make over there, but I think we'll move on to the third question because I'm just being cautious of time as well. Is around the principle around regulations and policies. And it comes down to the definition that HR in general nowadays, to a large extent, is automated, in the sense that there's a lot of filters before a human being talks to a human being, right? And those filters are basically where we're going to start seeing some layer of bias, algorithmic gamification, as we want to call it, right? So what do you think needs to be done with respect to policies and regulation when it comes to defining rules that act as gateways when allowing talent to come in? And to your point, there is a shift that we're seeing happen right now because of COVID and because of remote work taking over in general. The principle that being physically present somewhere doesn't attribute to the success in their job. What that means is it opens up borders and it just changes the game, because now there's suddenly an excess of talent where there was a lack of talent, right? There's suddenly more jobs than there were companies. It just completely switches the position. So what does that mean? How do you plan on creating a system that regulates the gatekeeper? Is it a central body? Is it per company? What are your thoughts over there? Let's go the other way around this time. Let's start off with Jorge.
Yeah, I think in terms of regulation, something I've done some projects advising governments on AI regulation, and something that I've noticed is just that the reality is that people who work in government often don't have a background in engineering or in specifically computer science and artificial intelligence, at least in the United States. I know that's different, especially in having conversations with friends who are from Singapore. I know, for example, in Singapore, there's actually a really strong effort to bring in engineers and technologists into government and to have those people who have built these products to help inform tech policy. But that's not the case in many other governments, particularly in the United States. So I think one of the key things that can be done is to improve the diversity within government as well, and specifically diversity with regard to bringing in people who have different perspectives in professional backgrounds. And especially currently, I think technologists and engineers are underrepresented in government. So we have to figure out a way for governments to recruit technologists and engineers into government roles, and also think about compensating and incentivizing these jobs so that they can attract people who otherwise might go work at large tech companies to come in and help build this policy that's going to impact the products that they've already been working throughout their entire professional careers building. I think another key point is that in terms of regulating systems to deal with hiring, the reality is that I think that AI should be used in ways that augments the human experience. And we have to think about it also bringing it back to how we think about things in the physical world. Like, the reality is that if we look at, for example, any sort of in-person interaction, like if I go to a restaurant, I would expect the restaurant to serve the same quality of food to a Black person and a white person. If we saw that a restaurant is consistently serving undercooked or lower quality food to a particular group of people, we would say that restaurant is racist. This is totally unacceptable. If I go to the movies and I see that men are being placed in more comfortable, roomier seats than women every single time, I would say this is completely unacceptable. This is wrong. But how come when we deal in the software space with AI applications, we're perfectly okay with situations in which the software is particularly providing lower quality or harmful experiences to particular groups of people, especially along groups that are protected classes, like under gender, sex, race? If this is not okay in the physical world, why do we accept it in software? Like, why do we accept that there's certain photo applications that provide a pretty flawless experience for white people and then have a really hard time or even almost unusable for detecting Black people? This is unacceptable in the physical world, and I think we should also take that into consideration and have government and policymakers put into effect policies that protect these groups of people in the software realm as well.
Sorry, I was muted. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's actually some very valid points that you raised. And I'd like to move that same question on to Ovetta and get your thoughts on this particular topic around regulation on software being the gatekeeper for hiring people.
Yeah, so I guess, so algorithms are neither good, bad, or indifferent, right? They're engineered and they do what you ask them to do, what they're programmed to do, and they're exceedingly good at it, right? And so when it comes to software being used for hiring purposes, and people point to sensational kind of like bias trends. You know, one of the first instances of this was in the 1980s in the UK, when some, you know, enterprising professor wrote an algorithm to help them to select medical students. And what he did was he just based the algorithm based upon the selection committee, who had to read tons and tons of applications. So it was, the intent was that it was to augment their abilities to pick the right medical students. But one of the things that the algorithm picked up that they didn't find until years later was that that board was biased. If the application had grammatical errors, for example, it was rejected by the board. So the algorithm did the same thing. If the application had dates that said, I may have to drop out at this point or whatever, by women who were either pregnant at the time or married or whatever, that was set aside by the board, and the algorithm just picked that up. And it was exceedingly good. It was better than the board at, you know, it was so good that like 80% of the applicants or something in the 80s at the UK medical school were like all white and from Western places. Indian doctors and women and all were not even admitted. And that's when people realized something was wrong, right? And so I think we have to look at why we are using these systems, who is using them, and where they're learning whatever they're doing, where they're learning it from. Because it's easy to say it's the software, but we all know that software, some software we create does create itself, but it always starts with us. So I wrote this Medium piece saying we're the problem. You know, our history of systemic racism and sexism and patriarchy is the problem. It's in the census. You know, we still don't count LGBTQ folks in the census. So yeah, that's a data, that's a government, that's a regulated thing. But if you are not in the census, you don't count, right? So we're the problem. We are the solution that needs to be fixed. And I know that seems really kind of like astronomical a little bit, but to be tactical about it, anything that we create to augment us will be a reflection of us. And so therefore, we have to be really brutally honest about who we are as humans, as creators, as technologists, and as users. And so we can't just say it was the software, but we definitely have to say the software can be used and weaponized against us. And so we tactically, when we are sitting in the room, we do something called harms model. This is what we do at Microsoft, and we do it with all kinds of AI technology. And we literally sit down and go through all the people who could be harmed by this. We don't turn a blind eye. See, technologists have this thing that, you know, algorithms are agnostic and they're neutral. They're not bad. They won't admit it, right? That humans are bad sometimes. And so that's the start. We have to admit that. And then we have to go through black hat, white hat, villain, supervillain, hero. You have to really go through all the scenarios where this could go wrong. And you have to do it before you build it. And you have to bring in other people who don't have your mental model, people who will be affected by it, to help you, tell you what could go wrong with them. That's what I used to do as a design researcher. So co-creation and co-participation in design and AI is a must. You cannot create whatever AI you're going to create in the vacuum of your product making. You have to bring the people who will be affected by this AI, and you have to bring them in and co-create with them, because the impact is going to be swift, fast, and at scale. And if you don't bring folks in who are going to be impacted by this technology, you will miss something. And when we created our AI ethics cards at IDEO, we had 4 truths. And the first one was data is not truth. That was the first one, the fallibility of it. And the second one was don't presume the desirability of AI. I say designers' job in the future will be what not to design, not what to design. And the third is respect privacy and the collective good, which we understand. But the fourth is unintended consequences of AI are opportunities for design. Expect something will go wrong and redesign it. End of story. Do not assume that when you use AI and you design it, it will be perfect. So expect it will be wrong and redesign it.
Fair enough. I think that's a great way to put it. I couldn't agree with you more. I always encourage, it's artificial intelligence, we always talk about the principle of overfitting, in the sense that if you train it to do a certain thing, it only does that, and it gets completely confused when you throw a spanner in the works and how you can handle that. So having the diversity of data is pretty much the definition of success in the end, right? But like to your point, it's trained by people, and what people define as the rules of success is inherently what that defines as its bias. So you're on the money there. I'd love to throw that question on to Oriana, and then after that we'll take some questions that have been coming in from the chats.
Yeah, I think just going off like what Ovetta was saying, in terms of taking back the power of people from this technology, I think we put a lot of power into the technology, saying it's the algorithms, oh my God, it's the technology, oh my God, it's, you know, kind of putting the onus on the technology rather than taking the accountability as the humans who are creating the technology, developing the technology, deploying the technology, and the companies behind that. So I think it's really important that, like you said, we go to the table and we have these people who are actually going to be like, how are we using this technology? How are we developing this technology? And continuing to have these conversations, because in terms of using it for hiring, there's been, you know, obviously it is great that remote work and we can, you know, cross borders and hire around the world now. But at the same time, using this technology, I've seen where you can basically examine someone's like face to see what emotions they're giving off, and that will tell you whether they're happy or they're sad or they're going to be enthusiastic for the role. When actually the science of emotions anyway tells you that from different cultures, certain facial expressions mean something completely different. And is that going to be programmed into AI, and then are you going to be losing someone who could potentially be amazing for your organization because of that fault in the technology? So I personally worry a lot when it comes to HR hiring AI technologies. I think there's already enough discrimination in terms of just interviewing in general. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's enough discrimination out there already in terms of just the old-fashioned way of hiring people with the resume. Like you were saying, people would look at your postcode or zip code and be like, that's a no. And now you have an algorithm that does that, and then
that's a no. Yeah,
exactly, that's a no. And I feel like it's already being perpetuated. So this HR hiring technology to me has been quite problematic for a while now, and I haven't really seen companies using it in a meaningful way as of yet. Maybe I'm wrong, but for me personally, I haven't seen any company using that technology in a meaningful way. But I think we need to have these conversations and make sure that there are some kind of regulations around this. So again, I think it goes back to how we develop AI though, because AI is going to be in not just HR, it's going to be in all the technologies we see. So it's really important we continue to have like every person at the table being able to make these decisions. I think accountability is a really big one when we think about this, and people being held to account rather than, I think it's quite easy, like Ovetta was saying, to put the onus on the technology and be like, oh, it's the tech, not us. So I think, that would be my interpretation of it.
No, that's absolutely a fair point, and you're not wrong, because I built a HR software a long time ago, and those are the exact questions that we would often field is, and the reason I mentioned that is because of a question that just came in recently is, what are people's thoughts on anonymized job applications? What does that actually mean? It's a tough one, because I've been on the playing field with it with our product, and I saw how that necessarily wasn't the end-all be-all solution. But I'd love to throw the question out to, and being conservative with time, we'll just select maybe 2 per question. So we've got 2 or 3 questions that we need to field through. So I guess the question is, what are your thoughts on anonymized job applications? I'll throw the question off to Ovetta to begin with, and then we can probably have Oriana answer that, and then the next question we'll get Jorge to answer.
Are people viewing those resumes?
So the way it would necessarily work is people would view.
Oriana, we are the problem. Okay, so think about who gets hired at companies, right? Like I was at IDEO for over 3.5 years, and I worked with the HR because we were trying to do diversity and all that good stuff. And then an astounding number of people who got hired at IDEO were referred by the IDEOer. No algorithm or anonymized is going to fix that, right? That if you think about who gets hired at companies, the highest percentage, just think about it, will be referrals.
Yeah, so that's a statistical fact.
An egg argument, but I guess it is because the algorithm, again, is a manifestation of and a microcosm of who we are. So if we have a culture of bro, bias, whatever, those are the people who are going to get hired in that culture. So why is somebody using an algorithm or whatever has to go back to what the organization stands for and who they are. If we don't change that mentality of culture add versus culture fit, diversity and inclusion versus who I know, we have to unlearn these things. These are things we have to unlearn. So nothing against, we could fool AI all we want, but we can't fool ourselves.
Yep, no, that's fair. That's a great answer. Thank you so much. I'd love a quick answer from you on that topic as well, Oriana, and then we'll move on to the next question from the crowd.
Yeah, I mean, to be quick, I completely agree with Ovetta. I feel like it's the same thing. All the companies I've worked at, everyone's being referred. Referrals are easy, they're quick. It takes the time away. It's easier in HR standpoint. Just this person will be referred, bring them in. So, I mean, AI can be used in great ways, yes, it can. But I think in the HR space and hiring, I'm cynical about it.
Yeah, fair enough.
Cynical about how it could be used necessarily in an amazing way that we can do ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair.
You're using AI to find diverse candidates, like they're flipping it around. So my friend who works at IDEO, he built an app that uses AI to actually find anomalies, right? Like quote unquote candidates that don't fit all the other candidates in your company. So again, like that's intentional, right? That's engineered. That's fixing us, not the technology. So that's an example that I know for sure of using it in a way to flip it in how it was used before. So it's about the purpose. Like, are we using AI to be lazy, right? The colonized.
I think we are, yeah.
Master thing. I'm the master and you're the slave, AI, and you go do all these little slave tasks and stuff. Or are we using AI to enhance the human experience and augment human need? And so again, it's about the purpose, and it starts with us. So you can create the AI to go find the anomaly, or you can create the AI to perpetuate the same biases.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. No, that's absolutely fair. And we've got an interesting question from Amy. Sorry if I got your name wrong. But the question is, how can we reduce bias and increase diversity of a data pool or artificial intelligence information to capture what we need to be as transparent as it can be to data? The last part got a little confusing, but essentially, I guess what they're trying to ask is, what can we do to reduce bias in the data pool? And I'll throw that question at Jorge. I'd love to get your thought on that.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things is the hiring component plays a big role in it, because usually as someone who's developing a product, you also have to at some point test it out yourself. So if in that process you are, for example, let's go back to the photo application, which is very clear. If you are testing that and trying to find yourself in your library of photos and it can't find you, you're probably going to call that out as a feature that needs to be fixed. But if there's no one that is impacted by that, then it's less likely that that problem would get propagated and addressed before launch. So that's one component. And I think like the diversity of having people who are building the products and also having people at the top will in turn help make it more likely that we are seeking data inputs into these models that are more representative of people from many different backgrounds. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that even despite our best intentions, there's going to be shortfalls. And so I think something that could be implemented is more features around the interpretability of models. So being able to see precisely what are the neurons that are being activated. If you're looking at an image, which pixels are the ones that are most associated with certain features in your model, and then trying to see if there's any of those features that are being highlighted that could be problematic, that maybe are based on historical biases. For example, like if we were to try to use AI as a full replacement for the bail system, you could think that potentially that some of the inputs into this could actually be related to historical crime data. But as we all know, historical crime data is not based on who is committing the most crimes. It's based on who is getting caught for committing the most crimes, or who is getting caught, period, even if they haven't committed crimes. So it's we have to think about how the data is being collected, where it is being collected from, what is the geographic context of where it's being connected, the cultural context in which it's being collected, and whether that is an accurate representation of reality.
That's fair. I think you've all nailed it on the head. And I think I've got one last question to field through from the chat, which is actually an interesting one, which is, how can we make unconscious more conscious? And that's a very meta question. I don't expect an answer from anyone over here, but just to play the cat, I'd love to throw the question at Oriana. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can make unconscious more conscious. Thanks for that question, Paul, by the way.
Was that just the unconscious data sets? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going with what I've got over here, and that's the question. So you can try sprinkle with something, because I know that's a very, very deep question. But perhaps what we'll do is we'll wait for them to come back with some clarity. What we'll do is we'll go to the other question, which is unconscious bias, I think is what they were referring to. Is how do you propagate unconscious bias? Are there psychological systems right now that happen? Is there unconscious? How do you operate unconscious bias?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Well, we know that there are 188 unconscious bias. We already know that. Psychology has told us.
Okay.
Right? So we've identified, now there may be more. I'm not saying there aren't, but Stanley Milgram could probably just read his book and he would tell you pretty much all of them, right? Like that's the 6 degrees of separation, guys. So folks like that have been doing this type of psychological research for a long time. I have an HCI degree, so that's how we learn about it. And the way that you make sure that those things are put into your process of product making is to hire a person with that background, a social scientist, a psychologist, who becomes a design researcher, and they work with, like I did, data scientists and developers to develop products where they say, hey, automation bias is going to play a part. And let me show you in this research study, because we know that automation bias is real. Once we trust a machine to do something, we will defer to the machine, to the point of the machine being wrong. This was proven. Daniel Kahneman, he proved that. Bunch of students, very smart, Stanford, were in a classroom, and the robot said, "There's a fire, come follow me," right? And they saw the smoke and followed the robot into the smoke, right? It's automation. They trust the robot because it's a machine and it gave them direction. So I think what's happening here is that it's not like we don't know that there's unconscious bias. It's just that we're not recognizing it when we're making products. And you can't depend on just the technologists to know that. So you have to have a human-centered, multidisciplinary team creating AI. If you don't, you're going to create AI that plays upon the fragility of humanity, which is exactly what happened in 2016, which is exactly why we had a flat earth conference. And it is exactly why people are not vaccinating their kids. You laugh, but this is real. This is real. Algorithms are programmed to work, and they work really well. And when you have algorithms and they coincide with cognitive biases, you get people who say the earth is flat because association bias says that it is. Confirmation bias says that it is. Yeah. So now you get people who there was a quote about Eli Pozo. He wrote this about social media and the internet was going to have people think outside reality. And somebody from another guy said, now people are making their own reality, right? Because their social media feed is telling them what their reality is. That's confirmation bias. Yeah. So we know these things. We just got we have to get the people who know these things in the room who are making these products.
No, that's it's a heavy topic, but it's a great answer. I can't disagree with that. I laugh at flat earthers just because it's just.
I know everybody. I speak all the time, and that's an example I bring up.
I've never met one, but I know if I meet someone, it'll just be such a fascinating conversation to have. Where I'm like, how?
Deep explanation of humans and machines of why we had a conference where 800 people showed up because they believe that the earth is flat. Now,
I mean, to be honest, I'd love to get their email addresses. I'm sure I can sell them something if they're that gullible.
I don't blame them, though. I really don't. Because there were biases that were plagued upon them by these products. And YouTube had to change their algorithm. They did. They changed it. So I don't make fun of them. They never had a choice. They literally never had a chance. There were a lot of things that influenced these thought patterns in 2016 before people started raising alarm bells. And finally, Google said, we have to change our YouTube algorithm because we're impacting people in a way we don't want to.
Yep.
And that's real.
Fair enough. Well, I want to thank the three of you for taking time to actually come in and share your thoughts on such an interesting and rather complex topic. I'll pass the stage on to Lily from NewCampus to handle the next bit.
Thank you, everyone, for such an insightful and very passionate discussion. I love how in the events chat as well, everyone was talking about Black Mirror and the consequences of technology around that as well. So if you guys haven't watched Black Mirror, you should definitely do that as well. But thank you, Vaibhav, for moderating, for asking such insightful questions, and for all the guests today, Oriana, Ovetta, Jorge. Thank you so much for coming. It was such a pleasure to have all of you share your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.
Amazing. So we went a little bit over time today, so we're going to skip the next networking session, and we're going to have a quick 5-minute break before we jump into the third session for today, which will be with Erica Chong, Theranos whistleblower. So this will be a talk and a fireside, also moderated by Grace Chow. So be sure to be back at 1:15 p.m. And we'll see you then.